Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Aware, Relaxed, Connected podcast. Join me as we explore approaches and orientations towards cultivating the physical body, the internal landscapes, the mind, and our relationship with reality as a whole. I'm your host, Craig Mallet. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I hope you've been having a nice time. I am here on the Sunshine Coast, which is not very sunny at the moment. It's actually been quite wet. For those of you who aren't from the area, there was a big cyclone that kind of came through nearby, and it's wrecked a bunch of stuff, and there's been winds and floods and all the rest. Thankfully, I wasn't too involved in that. I was in an area that was somehow almost skipped, although a few towns nearby were damaged quite severely. So I hope if you were in those regions that you're safe and that you're getting dry now and finding everything you need to find to start cleaning up and repairing and recovering and everything else. And if you're not in those areas, that you're having a lovely time, whatever you're doing. This week, I really wanted to start getting into the meaty bits of my work. And, I talked in the intro podcast about all the different aspects, the physical training, the internal training, the mental training, and the non-duality parts. Um, those are all pieces that revolve around one process. And I've spent a lot of time in this field investigating and reducing and digging for essences. And this process that's at the heart of everything has really started to become obviously and apparently the essence of what I do, what kind of makes it stand out on its own, if it does that. And I wanted to go into some detail about that process. Now, if you're new here, you might not have a clue what I'm talking about with this process, so I want to explain that too. If you're not new and you're familiar with my work, you've probably been hearing me go on and on about opening and releasing for like at least the last year or so, probably a bit longer than that. And it's really something I started to get onto because I was just looking at what was happening to me in my own training and also hearing like a nice couple of choice cues in podcasts, listening to various people and reading books and things like this. And it kind of all started to come together, like what I was doing and what was the point of it all. And so this process really has two parts, and I want to get into these two parts and kind of bring some detail to them. The words I'm using for this are opening and releasing. Um, and we have to know that whenever there's any language used, that language really isn't quite the same as what's going on. That language points to something. And for the most part, it's much easier to show someone this something often when I'm teaching people, I'll say, open the shoulders. And they will say, I don't get what you mean. I'm like, touch my shoulders, feel. And then when I do this, what do you feel? Oh, yeah, it spreads apart and it opens. Okay, yes, it's that. That's the opening. Um, that is obviously a little hard to get across on a podcast where all you've got is my voice. You don't even have a picture of me as you would on a video or anything like that. But nevertheless, I'm going to do my best to try and explain it all. So there are these two processes, opening and releasing. Excuse me. And the idea is that we are wanting to get those two processes connected or to start to recognize that they are actually two aspects or two faces of the same process in the same way that heads and tails are two faces of the same coin. So they can't really go without each other. And if they're missing their partner, then it changes the dynamic. So we'll start with opening because we must start with opening. Opening is the yang aspect as yin and yang. Yang in that it is an expansive force, it is spreading out, but opening is also a connecting force. Opening brings a connection between two parts. So if you think of holding a string, you've got a string holding one end in one hand and one end in the other, and you think of the two ends of the string that you're holding and you move those ends further away from each other, like you're spreading your hands apart. This is an opening action. And what's going to happen at some point is that the tension of the string is going to start resisting the opening. As that resistance comes into play, as the string sort of starts to go taut and starts to get a structure instead of being floppy and loose, you start to see a connection. There's a resonance or a response. When I do something with point A, say my left hand, I can feel that in my right hand. I can feel the connection between the left and the right because I've spread them apart, because I've opened them away from each other. So this opening capacity puts me in contact with something that maybe, yes, technically it was connected beforehand, but I couldn't feel it, right? If the string is slack, I can't easily feel what I do on one hand resonating in the other hand. So I open it up, it becomes taut, and then there's a connection and I can feel what's going on in between them. This is a really good analogy for the physical body, and I'm going to stick with the physical body. And later in the podcast, I'll move into how these processes work in the mental body, and then later in all of life and things like this. But the point is that there's this connection between one side and the other that you didn't notice was there. It was kind of hidden, and it only become apparent when I opened and made the string taut. Then I could feel it, and when I can feel it, I can work with it. So the idea of opening is to reveal something. To open to something is to reveal it, right? If I have something in a closed fist in the center of my hand, you can't see what it is. And if I open my hand, then you can see what's in my hand. Same with any opening. I open a door, I can see what's through the door and so on and so forth. So opening really reveals something and it connects something with another. If I open the door to my house, the inside and the outside are now connected. There's like a pathway between the two. There's a kind of a way of getting from one to the other, or a way that one responds and affects the other. If my door is closed and it's belting rain, no rain comes inside. But as soon as I open that door, the rain that's outside starts coming in, the wind starts coming in, inside is affected by outside and vice versa. So there's a connection. Um, so opening reveals something. It reveals a connection between two things. Now, often when we're training, what this opening is going to reveal physically, let's start with, is tension in the body. If I start spreading my joints apart, my flesh apart, and things like that, at some point, something is going to stop that spreading, that opening action. Resistance will appear. What we've got here is a connection between A and B. It might be a very crude and tight and kind of jammed up connection, but it's a connection nonetheless. So, if I start spreading my hand apart, opening my hand, then at some point it starts getting wider and wider and wider. And I start to feel resistance. I start to feel tension that prevents me from opening further. This is both a good thing because we really want that connection. Part of what I'm doing is called both aware and connected, right? I'm aware that there's a connection between A and B now, and it is connected. There's a connection there. I now can, if I spread my hand out and I move my pinky finger, it's going to affect my thumb and vice versa. So there's a connection there. But, and here's the problem with opening invites tension at some point, invites resistance. It reveals resistance. And if we keep pushing the opening, and for example, in the example of my hand, and I use this example in all my workshops because it's very easy. If I spread my hand like really far apart, get my fingers as far apart as possible, make them as long as possible, you start to feel more and more and more and more tension and resistance, and this becomes more rigid at some point. Um, so the downside, the negative aspect of opening is that if I open too strongly, I meet resistance, and the more I push the opening, the more this resistance is going to appear. Opening can show up in different forms too. For example, if I have someone approaching me and I want to keep them away, I do a push, right? And a push is essentially an opening of space between me or my center and the person approaching me. I'm making space. If I keep extending my hand away from me to make more and more space, at some point, my arm's going to get very tense. If I keep reaching even further beyond that, I'm going to get more and more and more and more and more and more and more tense. And, you know, that would just get kind of like burnt out at some point. It'll get too much at some point. This opening is then really related to a kind of fight. It's a fight, it's a battle, it's a meeting of resistance and going against that resistance to keep opening. And so the opening, yes, reveals something, usually resistance, but it can reveal plenty of things. And if the opening is pushed too far without its partner releasing, which we'll talk about in a sec, then things get tense. So, from a practical training perspective, opening is really about taking my alignment points, right? I align myself, I stand myself up, I lengthen my spine, I spread my shoulders, I open the hands up, I open the feet up. I'm putting space everywhere in the body. And as any good physio knows, if you do this to excess, if you push yourself into this kind of quote unquote ideal posture, then you're going to end up with trouble in the long run because the opening invites tension and the tension will become habitual at some point and then it'll set in and you'll kind of be stuck pathologically in this assumed perfect posture. And that makes you very rigid and unpliable and unable to do things like go into a shitty posture, for example. So, yeah, the opening can be problematic on its own. Too much opening, it's rigidity, it's also kind of excessive trying, excessive force. This is kind of also lives in this too much opening dimension. Um, the other side of the coin is releasing, and releasing is really letting go of effort, letting go of pressure, letting go of tension. And releasing really is a kind of softening, a relaxing, a draining away of pressure and tension. Let's call it that. Now, as you can probably imagine, if I release too much, then I end up with a collapse. The system will fall over. If I'm releasing my bodily tension, for example, and I release too much, my body will just fall over and be a pile on the ground. There's no more structure. There's no more tension to hold it in place. I release everything, and so I flop. The other interesting thing that happens with release is that all the tension that is there anyway kind of goes into hiding, right? If I release so much that it just gets soft and floppy, the collapsing that's actually happening there, the collapsing hides pathological tension. It hides holding points of holding and areas of holding. It conceals a lot of stuff. The releasing action is more yin, and yin has this like shadowy concealing quality to it. So when I release too much, when I let go too much, a few things happen. All of my tensions disappear, my connections as a result disappear, and I end up concealing the pathological or hidden tensions that are present in the system. They kind of get packed away. Everything that's in quarantine goes further into quarantine. It goes and hides even more if I release too much. So again, it can be really nice to look at the example of the hand. If you spread the hand out too much, it becomes rigid, it becomes tense. If I just release the hand completely, it actually collapses into a kind of, the dead fish. I don't know if you've ever shaken hands with someone who has no structure in their hand or whatever. It just feels like looseness. It's like a floppy noodle that just has no anything to it, no oomph, no structure, no anything. And so this is like a really collapsed um, structure, a collapsed person. And that collapsed is inherently kind of like bound by anxiety because there's all of these hidden things in the system that are just getting packed away and concealed and not getting dealt with, and they can pile up and pile up. And if I keep collapsing, not only do I not have any structure to meet the world with, but I have no oomph. I have no kind of zest in my system. The collapse structure is really like more like in the flight, kind of in fight or flight. Collapse is really like a type of flight, a type of escaping from confrontation, and escaping resistance and escaping pressure and all of this kind of stuff. So we see physically, at least, if I spread my hand out and get the opening thing working, and then I match this spreading out with releasing, and I start to relax and release the tension in my hand, I'll end up, to begin with at least, with a kind of flip flop. I release so much from my hand that my hand collapses. And then I go, no, that was too much. I'm going to spread my hand out again. And it starts to become a little rigid, and you feel it's too rigid. And so you release, and then it collapses. And then so you spread out and it gets rigid again. And you have this kind of back and forth that is the start of the refinement of this process. So, as these two processes start to get kind of more connected and more um, communicating with each other, then you start to see something very interesting. I open my hand and I release the pressure out of my hand, but I don't let the hand collapse. So it stays open. Even better, it's as if the opening is in, let's call it potential. There's the potential or the charge that the system wants to open more. But the more refined we get, the more the opening opens until there's just the lightest hint of resistance. And then as that resistance is as it is met, sorry, it starts melting away from the release. But as the resistance releases and disappears, I open more. So because the resistance has melted away, because there's nothing preventing the opening anymore, the opening wants to continue. So the opening is always in a kind of state of potential, that it would open more the moment the resistance disappears. The moment there is release of resistance, it's going to open more. So it's always, the idea is that you want it always sitting in that charge of wanting to open, but never ever pushing past the resistance. The opening brings me into contact with resistance, and the more refined I get in my opening, the more I meet that contact point just at the moment it appears. So as I open my hand and I start to feel the slightest hints of resistance, I don't blast past that until my hand's very rigid, but rather I stay on that edge and I let that resistance release away and melt away. And because the resistance melts away, my hand can open more. And so it opens a bit more until it meets next resistance. And then I hang out on that resistance until it melts away. And as it melts away, my hand can open a bit more. So we start to get into this process where the more I release, the more I can open. And the more I open, the more I reveal things that can be released, little tensions that appear and resistances that are appearing. So we end up in this process that's cyclical, right? I open until there's resistance, and then I wait and let the resistance release. And when it releases, I can open more. And because I open more, it reveals more resistance, and so on and so forth. Um, then what will happen with this process is it will start to go deeper. As you release superficial layers of tension, the release will take the pressure and the opening deeper into the system, and you'll start to open to tensions in your system you never felt before. You'll start to feel things in your system that you didn't feel before. And as you open to them and you start feeling those resistances, and you start to get refined with this approach of opening to the next resistance, then you can release that resistance, or let it release itself is perhaps more accurate. And as it releases, you let it open even more, and opening and release continue deeper and deeper and deeper. So this is the basic idea, right? As the two processes start to get more refined, they start to work off the back of each other. And the more you have this connection or this marriage between the two processes, the more they start to seem like one process. Like, is it opening or is it releasing that's starting this? I'm not sure. I just have this process that I start to be familiar with and I can just start going. And as I enter that process, things open and things release. And I don't really do either side of the process more than the other. They're both kind of equal or harmonized. And they kind of bridge and they kind of become the same thing. This point is where it starts to feel more like the attentive listening idea. So I bring my attentive listening, I bring my attention to anywhere in my body. And as the attention meets that part of the body, this process naturally starts of its own accord and starts to go deeper and starts to just propagate itself around the system. And we just leave our attention there as a kind of fuel that lets this process run on its own. And I get less and less in the director's chair and more in the observer's chair, so to speak. And then, on and on this goes. What this process looks like in the mind is very similar if we start to consider that intent and distraction and thinking cycles and emotional movements and all of that are also just forms of, let's call them structural resistance. Then the process working through the mind actually starts to reveal aspects of the mind. It'll start to reveal, oh, there's an intent I had that's kind of like trying too hard. It's trying to force the matter too much. And I suddenly realize that it's there. It's been there the whole time, working unconsciously. But suddenly I have this like, aha, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that, which is the opening. As we get to the opening, then we can actually let that force of the mind release itself slowly. And once it releases, we can open more. And so the process is going to be exactly the same in the mind as it is in the body, only we're going to be dealing with mental structures instead of physical structures. And mental structures and mental resistance shows up as like ideas or thoughts or beliefs or bad feelings or emotions or things like this. So you're in your practice and all of a sudden there's this really strong like I don't want to be here. Oh, something bad is happening. I need to get out of here. That's just attention that's being revealed. If we can stay connected to it, keep our opening and let it release itself, then we'll actually be liberated from that particular mental tension. And that liberation, that release, will let us open deeper into our mind and we'll see the next resistance and the next, pattern of whatever habitual resistance. And then that can release and so on and so forth. So the process starts being much the same as the process in the body, but it's just happening in the mind. So if we start understanding and recognizing that whenever anything is being revealed, like if I am opening my mind to itself and I start to see pressure and tension and silly thoughts and everything else, that's actually the opening process working really well. It just needs to be met with the releasing process, which is the letting go of those um, thoughts, of those feelings, of those emotions, to let them release themselves. And again, I use this term like let it release itself. Release is more of the yin aspect, it's less active. The opening is more of the active part. I kind of have to keep the opening, I have to keep the space, the spreading apart, and maintain the connection. Because if the connection falls away and disappears, and the tension kind of disappears out of my awareness, I can't release anything. I can't really do too much to release um, a pressure that I'm not aware of. How do I release something that I can't feel, that I'm not aware of? Well, it's difficult. It's not so easy. It is possible, but let's talk about that maybe on another episode. So we've got the opening, which inherently spreads out and reveals, and we've got the releasing, which lets go of holding on those things. Now, each of these factors have a kind of dynamic associated with it. Opening goes from the center and expands outward and upward. It kind of expands up and out and inflates and spreads apart. Releasing, on the other hand, goes the opposite direction. It goes from the extremities and relaxes into the center and gathers into the center somehow in towards the middle, going from outside to in, whereas opening is from inside to out. So releasing really is the bit of it that's going to give me my grounding. Like, and it needs both parts, right? I can't do releasing without opening. If I do releasing without opening, it's collapse. But the releasing side of things is what's going to give that sense of anchoring, that sense of stillness, that sense of um, solidity from gathering together. When I release in towards my center and I gather myself towards my center and eventually connect to my center through releasing, and I start to feel a tension in the shoulder and I release that to my center and I feel a tension in my head, in my mind, and I release that to the center and so on and so forth. That's the part that's going to really give me a sense of feeling at ease with being myself. That's the super important part. The opening is like the space through which that happens. If our body can be considered like a tube, right? It's a bunch of tubes. And if those tubes are wider open, then more stuff can move through them, more pressure can move through the system if it's more open in a kind of generic sense. So if I want to release more, I need more space for that stuff to release through, which is the opening. And if I collapse and all those pathways kind of crumble and become blocked, then I can't release even if I, have the most best level of attention ever. It doesn't matter. The release isn't going to move because there's a blockage in the way. That's a closure caused by a lack of opening. So why bother with this stuff? Why do this opening, this releasing, this process in the middle? What's the point? Where are we going with it? Why does it matter if my body's all spread out? There's a bazillion examples of people who never did any of this stuff and are like super healthy. And, those videos of 80-year-olds on YouTube doing pull ups and they're like super, super yoked and like jacked and look like they're having a pretty good time. So, why bother with this stuff? Why wouldn't I just go get, completely ripped like that? The answer is that these two qualities actually work everywhere in our lives if we understand them. Every moment I have a new moment, I need to open myself to that new moment. Every moment I am letting go of the previous moment, I need to release that moment. So, in a sense, this process, this opening and release process that we're training very physically in this approach to begin with, is actually teaching us the essence of a process that is going to be used at the life level at some point, at my day-to-day level. How can I open to this new moment, including which will connect me to it and all the pressures of that moment? Like I said, there was just a cyclone here. Can I open to the pressure of the moment with the cyclone and all the prep and all the crazy people and all the rest? And can I release that pressure through my system into my center so I become highly connected to it? Again, my system, I've gone back to using my old name of aware, relaxed, connected. These are the main things that are the qualities that appear when the process of opening and releasing is working, is kind of refining itself. So I become aware of the situation, I become connected to the situation, and I become very relaxed about it due to the release. The connection is the strength, is the power behind it. The release is the at easeness, right? That's what it's going to give. Both of these simultaneously, the strength with an at easeness, a letting go that doesn't at all get rid of the strength, but in fact amplifies it in a very funky way. It's also the same process I use to open my mind to release myself from, say, a held belief about something. I'm so certain that it's like this and not like that. And that when we release ourselves from that, then suddenly there's like, right. yes, that may have been the case in one particular context, but suddenly more options become available, right? There's the revealing of other possibilities that happen when we open and release in a really refined way. I suddenly let go of my assumptions and open to actually the mystery of life, right? Because when we get really open, we start to see that yes, I may be perceiving whatever I'm perceiving, but there's a whole bunch of context I'm almost certainly not aware of. And I can open to that lack as well. I can open to my lack of awareness and my lack of context in a situation. And as I open to that, that can bring a kind of pressure and a discomfort. Oh, I don't know what's going on. Oh, there's the releasing that softens that, right? That drains away that pressure while keeping me open to the mystery, to the discomfort, and I become weirdly comfortable with being uncomfortable. Um, so this process is really useful like this. It can be used to enter into, say, a new skill. I go to a class, I release my preconceived ideas of what I'm meant to be doing and how it's meant to go, and I open myself to what's going on, what the instructions are, what they're telling me to do, and so on and so forth. Going back to the physical for a second, a body that has got this quality of being able to open and connect and then release the resistance in that connection until the connection stays and it's very strongly established, but it's very soft and pliable. Um, and as that gets deeper and deeper, it gives a really nice efficiency across the system because the deeper you get with this, the more connected up everything is, the more you can't help that if someone touches your finger, the whole system responds like a spider's web. You know, if you touch any part of a spider's web, it's going to vibrate and move that entire web. And the same starts to be true of the body, that the more connected up the body is, the more we've revealed these kind of hidden pathological tensions that we then release, which opens me and connects me up to more, and so on and so forth. I'm connected to more, I'm releasing more, and the more I release, the more I connect, and the more I connect, the more I release. Then I start to get more and more connected without ever assuming I'm done because there's always more to connect to and always more to release from. And so when I come into a new scenario with this as a kind of fundamental skill, then I can start to easily open to whatever's going on and release any notion of how it's meant to be, how it's meant to be going. And this kind of brings us again back to the mental side of things because a lot of the tension in our lives, in our day-to-day lives, comes from expectation. When I come into a new scenario, I expect it's going to go like ABC, but instead it goes L, then Q, then B for some reason. And if I'm holding on really tightly to how I think it's going to go and it goes some other way, then I just end up with more and more and more resistance because reality and where I think reality is meant to be going end up on different pages. So if I can learn to release and open to what's actually going on, then I start to harmonize with reality. I start to get on the same page as reality. I start to be able to go, oh, there's a cyclone. Okay. All this, whatever anxiety of what if appears, and oh God, it's all going to go bad. And I just release all the pressure out of that. And okay, yes, there's a little bit of mental activity about the present situation, but that's just mental activity. And what's actually going on, I open to what's actually going on. Okay, I'm just sitting in my house and it's raining a bit, and there's a lot of news. Um, Suggesting that it might get bad. So it doesn't mean I don't do my preparation or anything, but I start to do it with a different tone. I start to do it with I don't actually know what's going on. I don't actually know how it's going to go. Let's see. Let's open to this next moment and release my expectations, and open to this next moment and release my expectations. And we start to step in harmony with what is when we do that rather than at war with what is. And this is definitely starting to become a necessary survival skill for this era, this kind of epoch ending era, as my friend Dave would say, that where seem to be at a crossroads where things that seem to be stable for like since the 70s or whenever this kind of period really started are now going away. We're losing things we were assumed were a given part of modern life. And if we go to war with that, we're going to have a really hard time. If we harmonize with it, then there's a lot better chance of it, let's not say going in a good direction, because actually to harmonize with it, you've got to get into this don't know. I don't know where it's going to go, but it starts to bring a real trust in the greater powers. And what I mean by that are whatever powers have determined that the world would progress the way it did, that civilization would build it up the way it's been built up, that the people who were born with the ideas that they had would be born. Like whatever powers drive that, whether you call it evolution or nature or God or whatever, those bigger powers operate on these like really huge timelines and really unfathomable um, kind of cycles that are just completely natural. And if we get on the same page as that, and it may be a very destructive cycle that we're in, but destruction is necessary to clear the way for the next creation. So we start seeing it like that. And, if we're harmonized with those bigger powers, then we'll work with them to achieve whatever we're meant to be achieving in our lifetime before we die. And hopefully that helps us, right? That gives us a sense of, again, connection, meaning, purpose, these kind of things. But it all comes off the back of this kind of opening into the unknown, releasing the known and opening into the unknown, which is where these qualities go at their more refined level. I realize that as I open, I don't know what's going to appear until it appears. And then when that appears, if I release through it or into it or let it release itself, the words are never perfect for this process, but let's say let it release itself, then it can unfold in the manner and the time that is necessary for that thing to unfold. So I'm open to it, and it's just letting it unfold as it does. Um, how many other ways can we talk about this? Okay, so if I have this opening and releasing quality available in my relationships, for example, I can open myself to the other person, to their perspective, to their context. I can have a sense of empathy, and I can release the need to be right about stuff. That's a difficult one. Releasing the need to be right about stuff, right? It brings a real empathy. We start to, when we get connected up internally, when this process deepens through all my tensions and I run into this tension and I stay with it for however long I need to stay with it before it releases, and then I go to the next tension and on and on and on it goes, I end up running into all my garbage, all my inconsistencies, all my um, hypocrisy, all of that stuff. And as I drop into it and connect to it and then release it, which means also releasing the need to be perfect. So, oh yeah, that's there, right? But that's what it's like to be a human. As those connections get stronger, then I'm able to recognize them more in other people. And so when people come around doing whatever stupid stuff, it's like, oh, I'm connected to the part of myself that does stupid stuff like that. And so I recognize myself in that other person's behavior. And so I can have an empathy for them. It doesn't mean I don't act to intervene on the stupid behavior, but I do it from a place of understanding rather than a place of superiority. I'm no longer better than that person and showing that person how to be a better human. I'm on the same page as that person. I've experienced that same thing. And, an intervention is just like, I remember and I wish someone would have intervened for me in this way. So I'm going to offer that, what I would have wanted done to me, to the other person, as a kind of act of compassion rather than an act of war. Um, and so it can still be very, possibly violent as you intervene like this. But when it's done from a place of opening and a place of releasing, this kind of union through the center, the violence that comes out, if it comes out in a nice way and things, again, there's the perfectionism falls away with this a lot too. But let's just say the intervention seems to go down in a more harmonious way. I've seen people call people on their nonsense from a really deeply connected place. And, often the person still kicks up and go, how dare you, and blah, blah, blah. But they end up walking away and thinking about it and coming back more often than not saying, like having received the message and having actually digested the message rather than just putting up the walls, right? There was maybe still the triggered response, but something got through. And this is a real part of when things are released, that they tend to soak through slowly rather than when they're forced, right? If I try and jam something in with like this forced opening, I'm going to make you open, um, that tends to build a tension, and that tension resists. The more and more you try, the more and more it resists. If you go, well, here's where I want to go, and I'm going to release through that, instead, the tone is different, right? There's this kind of like soaking in that actually has to take its time. So it doesn't even need to be good today. I'm just going to let it move through however far it moves through. And of course, as you practice this, you can have the release move a lot faster, but that's not the point, right? The point is actually the letting go of the need for it to move fast. Paradoxically, the more you let go of the need for it to move fast, the more it can move fast without interference or being inhibited by any of your own blockages, let's say. So this quality, this opening and releasing, that's at the heart of what I do. It really is affecting everything when we start to look at it from this big picture. So in the physical body, it's going to spread out my tissues. It's going to create a good structure and good alignment, but it's also going to release me deeply from needing to hold a perfect alignment. So I'll be pliable and able to move around. I'll become more connected, but more soft. So I get stronger through my connections, but softer and more relaxed through the release. Um, and I become more viscerally connected to my center. I can feel pressure applied to, say, my hand, traveling through and arriving and maybe even dissolving in my center, and pressure from my feet traveling up my legs and dissolving in my center, and so on and so forth. Um, as I start to bring this into other territory, like I go to, I don't know, a dance class that would normally make me really uncomfortable, I can learn to release that discomfort through to the center as well, and then open to the actual class and just have a try at the class and do it and kind of make it an enjoyable time rather than just this battle against something I don't really want to do. If I take this into learning martial arts, then I can learn to release my power, and I can learn to release the body from being bound to technique, and it can start to kind of automatically arrange as it does in that kind of flow state that athletes often talk about. So it actually brings this flow state into accessibility. Methodical accessibility is kind of what we're going to here. Because in a way, the deeper part of releases will actually release the unconscious to organize itself around whatever pressures there are. And the unconscious is really deeply tied to the body and a lot of things we do in the body. So, for example, if I'm driving a car, and I'm learning to drive, there's the kind of conscious version of it where it's like all clunky like a beginner. I push my foot in like that. I move the gear shift like this. I've got to indicate at the same time. And there's a lot of things to do. And as you're tracking and managing all those things consciously, they're clunky as hell and they don't work that well. The more that soaks into the unconscious and the more the unconscious is liberated to drive, suddenly you're able to do all of those things and have a chat to your friend in the car, or listen to me talk on a podcast the whole time, and you haven't really been paying attention to your driving the whole time, but it's still working. The unconscious is organizing itself around that activity and making it work far better than the conscious mind could. The opening and releasing process taps into that intelligence of the unconscious, but fuels it with conscious attention. So, as these two components bridge. The opening opens my awareness and my attention to something, and the releasing frees it to act, maybe according to the bigger view of the unconscious, because the unconscious is way more connected than our conscious mind is. It's always connected to our group and our environment and everything in ways that we're not consciously aware of. So as I release and liberate the unconscious, but I'm still open to what's going on, that saves me from getting stuck in repetitive ruts, right? If the unconscious works without my awareness, it just starts repeating at some point. Same with the driving analogy, right? At some point, if you've stopped paying attention to your driving, you don't get any better or more evolved as a driver. You're kind of like, P plates, cool, I stopped paying attention because it's kind of working. And my system is just going to repeat that kind of working, never really getting better. The moment I bring attention back to it, even if I don't manage it, change stuff, and especially if I don't manage and change stuff because I released that kind of control mechanism, then it starts to get better. Oh, I just pay attention to how my foot goes on the brake and what the pressure's like and how my hand, hits the indicator. And the more I pay attention, the more it automatically refines itself. And so this actually starts to become a really interesting capacity that we can bring to lots of different parts of our life, particularly the parts that are kind of stuck on that loop, stuck on that unconscious cycling where it hasn't seemed to have evolved for a long time. And so we open into those hidden sticking points and then let the release of attention, let the sticking point release itself, as I said. Right. So again, we start to see here the common theme. Even though opening and releasing, I teach it as a physical thing, right? Spread the shoulder, let go of the tension there, lift the head, let go of the tension in the belly, all of this kind of stuff. The opening and releasing is very physical, but because we learn it through the physical training, it becomes way easier to bring the essence of that quality into the other realms. So as it comes into the internal realm, for example, and we start doing something like Dantian Gong or maybe like a Qigong or Neigong internal circulation path, of which there are many, you will start like the driving thing where you're kind of forcing it and it's clunky, but at some point you can release it and it'll start to run itself. And just like the driving, if I stop paying attention, it may keep running at that level and just never get deeper. And you're like, oh, yeah, that's nice. It's kind of working. But if I start to pay attention to the process, but release my control of the process, it does this strange thing. It evolves on its own. And this is where the real evolution of these practices is going to happen, not in the moment where I'm making the movement happen, but rather when the movement starts happening of its own and I'm not provoking it and I'm not intending it to happen, but it's happening. And I bring my attention and awareness to it. I open to it and I release it so it just does itself. Then the process gets deeper. And then, things like the Dantian Gong, the development of the lower center, will actually get some traction at that point. Because, and trust me, I can tell you from firsthand experience, you can try and force these things for like decades and it doesn't work, or it gets kind of stuck somewhere, gets stuck at a particular level where you can't force it anymore because forcing it is the problem. Um, but if you go to hell with it and then leave it where it is, it just never gets any better either. This union of the opening and releasing is what's required for this as well. When it comes to the practices of the mind, we see the same thing. A lot of mental practices have elements. Like there's one I use all the time, which is really great, is like imagine a sphere, imagine a ball. And all you're doing is keeping this imagination and trying to hold it. But we can do this in a like forced way where I'm making the sphere appear in my mind and I'm, oh, it's not quite right. I'm going to make it more right. Is it the right color? Da, 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 da. And there's all this force of it. I'm opening too much to the sphere and there's no release. Or I go, I'm going to imagine the sphere and I release too much. And then I'm like, do, what am I doing on the weekend? Oh, yeah, I guess the sphere. But I mean, the weekend, that person yelled at me at that point and blah, 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 blah. So again, the meeting of the opening and releasing works in the mind as well. I open myself to a internal image of a sphere, and then I release myself into that image. And then the sphere starts to stabilize because all the distractions come up, which they naturally will. And instead of cutting myself from the distraction and forcing myself back to the sphere, I go, oh, there's that distraction, release back to the sphere. And it's like the distraction melts into the sphere. And those words are very precise because as it's released, it'll lose its shape as a distraction and just become a kind of pure energy of attention or energy of awareness. And then it can join with the sphere. And the more that process is undertaken, um, the easier it becomes to gather together because the thing we're opening to gets a kind of mass and an attraction to it. So we see that it's really this process of opening and releasing. It doesn't matter what exercise I'm doing, whether I'm doing physical exercises, whether I'm doing internal exercises, whether I'm doing exercises, mental exercises, or whether I'm doing non-dual meditation, right? The heart of non-dual is a deep release into things as they are, into this moment as it is. And as that release deepens well beyond any kind of micro release, it's just like a macro version of the same thing. So everything I'm doing is supporting the same thing. It's doing the same thing just from different perspectives, from a micro perspective, from a macro perspective, from a physical perspective, from an internal perspective, from a mind perspective. And what this does, having one thing to be oriented about when there's 10 million practices, gives a sense of, right, I'm just doing that one thing. It's not that complex after all. And if I don't practice it in the physical context, but I practice it in the internal context, I'm still practicing it. I can translate it easily once I've developed it in any of the realms into the other realms, and it'll be very quick to bring that back up to speed. And so I don't necessarily have to practice every single thing every single day. All I need to practice is connecting to this process and refining this process. And I can then start to find a rhythm of looking at this process through the physical lens, and then looking at it through the internal lens, and then looking at it through the mental lens, and then looking at it through the non-dual lens, and then, oh, that's a nice lens. Let's come back to duality and look at it in my day-to-day life and all those different spots. But I'm always working on the same thing. And this is really nice because then I can have this kind of paradoxical, I am working on one thing and deepening one thing at the same time. I get to do new activities all the time. I get to try new practices all the time. I get to have new perspectives on this same thing all the time. And that keeps me evolving, and that keeps me developing, and that keeps me challenged, and stops me getting stagnant. So hopefully that almost hour long uh, word spew on this process has given you some insight into what I'm doing. If you're interested in the pragmatic side of, well, how do I actually get into this opening and releasing process? Jump onto my YouTube. There are a whole stack of videos there. It's just youtube.com/ at Craig Mallet. And I'll chuck a link in the show notes. Or even better, get on my Patreon. I've got a Patreon running now. I probably should have put this at the start. I will get better with the marketing thing as I get better with the podcast. But yeah, my Patreon is running, and I'm doing a practice of the week, and I'm specifically making the practice of the week kind of evolve week by week. So if you get onto the practice of the week, actually you'll have instructions of what to do every week for your practice. And I'll move through the mental and the physical and the internal and the non-dual spheres throughout the year in that practice. I might spend, several months on one topic before moving on to the next, but you'll actually start to see this process in action inside those practices, inside those practices of the week on my Patreon. So go check that out. The Patreon address is patreon.com/aware relaxed connected. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. And if you're super, super keen on really diving into this stuff, then I do offer mentorship where I'll guide you personally through a practice, and we'll bring this process into the context of the things you want to develop. Like, how can you learn this process? Yes, there are some basics to do, but how can we bring it into what you want to develop? I've got students who are cricket players and weightlifters and, I don't know, doing everything and any possible activity you can imagine. And we're just learning how to bring this process into the things they do. Of course, they ended up practicing a lot of qigong and a lot of breathing, a lot of meditation to learn this process, but pretty quickly they're able to slide it across into what activity they actually have a passion for and love. So if that sounds like it's up your alley, just shoot me a message and ask about the mentorship. I was also calling it a student program at one point, but I'm changing it to mentorship now because I like that sound of that better, and I think people understand what it means a little bit better. So that is the heart of everything. That is the opening and releasing. I will probably go into more details about this in future episodes. I mean, certainly we'll go into more details about this in future episodes. We may look a bit more closely at like the physical process and what actually happens as you go through these layers and how to deal with it. But for now, that's probably enough. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Next episode, I think will be another interview if things go according to plan. We'll just have to wait and see, but that should be within a week or two at the most. And I'm going to try and keep this kind of between a week and 2 weeks between episodes as best as I can. If you have a request for a topic on the podcast, if you want me to talk about something specific, or you want to come on and chat with me, or you want me to invite someone else specific on because you think it would be interesting for me to talk to them, then again, jump on over on my Patreon, drop a comment, drop a message. I'm going to probably, as the podcast gets more traction, uh, have the patrons really determine what the topics are about unless I've got a specific plan. But yeah, so head on over to Patreon and drop your suggestions or your questions. Otherwise, enjoy your week. I hope there is less rain for those people affected by such things, and I hope you have a really nice week. That's me signing off for now.